introduction again to Catherine Mason, a long-time member of the Computer Arts Society and a author who's written a great deal about the Computer Arts Society and digital art in general, including Computer in the Art Room, which essential reading, I would say. And you can, oh, just someone else coming in. And I would just comment on that. I find that a great read, and it's also available as an ebook on Amazon for just £5 or £6. So I would strongly suggest anybody who hasn't read A Computer in the Art Room, do a quick search on Amazon and get hold of a copy. It really brings together a lot of the research done in that early revisiting of the Computer Arts Society project. Very good. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Catherine. So the talk tonight is about George Mallen and the early Computer Arts Society. As you will find out if you don't know, George is one of the 3 original founders of the Computer Arts Society and was is a very creative individual, a lovely guy, and I think Catherine will give you a great talk about him and his work. So I'll hand over to you, Catherine.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sean. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Tonight's session, as Sean said, is going to concentrate on the history of computer art, interactive art, and generative art. And I'm planning to speak for about 50 minutes or so, and then I'm going to introduce Professor Stephen Boyd Davis of the Royal College of Art at the end, who's going to just say a few words about George and about his contribution to the book. So tonight's talk really is based on my new book, which is called Creative Simulations, published by Springer. And this book talks about the history of this early period in the 60s and 70s through the career of George Mallen and the founding of the Computer Arts Society and some of the early artworks and exhibitions that took place that Mallen was involved with during this very pivotal time in the early period of computer arts. So I'll tell you a bit more about the book later. But this was the early days of working with digital technology. And as you'll see tonight, many of these issues relating to art are ones that we are still very much concerned with today and are still being debated today. So let's start off by considering who George Mallen is. Well, he's a pioneer of computer systems since 1962, and he graduated in physics and worked for a short time at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. And this was a governmental organization that was part of the post-war push in Britain towards big science and computing. And it was here that he started to understand what could be done with computer simulation. And then after that, in about 1964, he started working with the British cybernetician Gordon Pask. And about 4 years later, he became, as Sean mentioned, one of the co-founders of the Computer Arts Society, along with Alan Sutcliffe and John Lansdowne in 1968. But it was his early days working with Gordon Pask at Pask's company Systems Research that put him in a very unique position to consider how he could use digital technology that arose from World War II and how he could harness it for public good. Now, Gordon Pask's company Systems Research was a sort of think tank, a cybernetic think tank, and it really became a convergence point of cognitive science, computer technology, and art in the UK. And here you can see a really fabulous photograph that came to light as a result of the recent research for the book, which shows Mallen at Pask's offices and studio in West London. And pictures like this are really very rare. So we are extremely thrilled to have discovered this and be able to publish it for the first time in the book. Now, after his time working with Pask, Mallen went on to found System Simulation Limited, or SSL. And this was around 1971. And this was a software development company that specialized in multimedia management systems. And it also provided software infrastructure for art and culture for several museums and also commercial image libraries. And even today, it carries on. It still remains one of the longest running software companies in the UK, although Mallen has retired. And here you can see George in the middle, and John Lansdowne is to his right, and Mike Stapleton is to his left, and they are pictured outside Lambeth Fire Station, which was close to their London offices at the time. Now, SSL was a great supporter of computer art and the roles of computers in cultural activities in many ways. And the most prominent of these ways was the fact that Mallen was the custodian of the CAS collection of artworks, works on paper. And these were pieces of mostly drawings, plotter drawings, impact prints that were exhibited over the years by CAS. And I'm going to show you some of the exhibitions that those drawings were in. These were accumulated and saved by Mallen at SSL. And this formed, and it was a very large collection, several hundred pieces. And this was donated to the Victoria and Albert Museum in 2007. And it really helped to form the major part of their now extensive collections of computer art. So it was thanks to George, really, that I myself got into computer art in 2002 when he started a project at Birkbeck, part of the University of London. So I've known George many years, and I'm extremely fond of him. He then became the President Emeritus of CAS in 2019. And this was in recognition of all that he has done for the creative, field of creative computing in his lifetime. And here you can see him in the center with his wife to the left and Nick Lambert, who was the previous chair of CAS, on the right. Now, George Mallen's career was very much influenced by the post-war theory of cybernetics. And it was in the 1960s that he saw the techniques of simulation were emerging as very powerful new tools and aids to decision-making and planning. And this was a time when there were optimistic outlooks towards the notion of progress. And he is very much a technological optimist. And he really believed, as did many intellectuals in the sciences at this time, that societal change could be brought about using technology informed by the principles of cybernetics and could help humanity. But let's consider what cybernetics is. Well, as you can see here, the American Norbert Wiener described it as the science of communication and control in the animal and the machine, or the communication within an observer and between the observer and their environment. So the theoretical study of the control processes in electronic, mechanical, and biological systems. And we can see straight away how this idea of communication control could appeal very much to artists. So who was Gordon Pask? Well, Gordon Pask had met Norbert Wiener at Cambridge, and he became a member of the British Cybernetics School. And he founded systems research where Mallen worked in the early 60s. Now, Pask styled himself a philosopher engineer, and he really was a polymath. He had interests in a wide variety of subjects. And the important point was that he wasn't just about theory. He was also very much into making things. And these were physical things that often crossed the boundaries of art, science, performance, theory, and experimentation. And here you can see on the left of the screen his Musicolor machine from 1953. And this is a machine that he built himself completely from scratch. And it really crossed the fields of art, music, performance, and science. And it's often considered the first cybernetically inspired performance system in the UK. It's incredibly early 1953. And really it can be seen as an example of the interrelationship between man and machine, human and machine. So this machine actually produced music and color and sound and performance and light. And you could use it to interact with audiences, which he did. And he toured it around London and had a couple of performances. But with the example of cybernetics, we could now see the computer has the potential to be more than just a design tool. It could actually be an agent for allowing interactivity and the ability to connect very closely with an audience. And it could also become a medium for the simulation of real life systems and even of the human brain. And that is what George Mallen was interested in. Now, a good example of this was one of Pask's theories in practice was the piece that he exhibited at Cybernetic Serendipity, the colloquy of mobiles. And this demonstrated one aspect of his conversation theory. And this definitely had an impact on George Mallen. Now, conversation theory was an attempt to explain learning in both organisms and machines. And the fundamental idea is that learning occurs through conversations about a subject matter, which serve to make the knowledge explicit to the learner. And in the case shown here, Pask would be considering the nature of creativity by using this piece of interactive art, this colloquy of mobiles. So it was exhibited in 1968 as part of Cybernetic Serendipity. And you can see it here. It's hanging from the ceiling in the center of this photograph. And it consisted of male and female robotic figures that interacted with each other and also reacted to the audience. So the audience could walk in between these rotating and moving sculptures hanging. And as they did so, they could they would react to each other and to the audience, who used lights to make them move and make them relate to each other. And the idea was that the piece learned as it went along. It learned through its interactivity. So it's really a precursor to today's AI artwork, you could say, in that we would probably talk about this as being machine learning. And these male and female robotic pieces attempted to reach an agreement or a state of homeostasis, some kind of state of agreement between themselves. And of course, there was a very humorous element too, because, you know, this was about male and female dynamic as well. So, but the idea of homeostasis, a cybernetic concept. So it was with Gordon Pask that George Mallen began to use digital simulation to model thought processes. And how can the digital be used as a simulation of the mind? And what would that look like? These were questions that came to him in the wake of cybernetic serendipity. Of course, also in the wake of cybernetic serendipity, we have the Computer Arts Society being founded. And we call it CAS for short. And it came out of discussions from the IFIP conference. That's the International Federation for Information Processing. This was a big conference held in Edinburgh that year, 1968. And as you can see here in the photograph, which I have to thank James Gardner for, I think he's in the audience, so thank you, James. It's a super photograph of this prize, which was won by Alan Sutcliffe and Peter Zinoviev. They won second prize for their computer-composed piece of music called ZASP. Now, ZASP was the first letters of Peter Zinoviev and Alan Sutcliffe, so Z-A-S-P. And Sutcliffe was a programmer who had an interest in computer-generated text, as well as performance and music. And he worked with the composer Peter Zinoviev programming his computers. Now, during this conference, which George Mallen was also in attendance, Sutcliffe collected the names and details of people who were remembered cybernetic serendipity, and they were very inspired by organizations like EAT, Experiments in Art and Technology, out of New York, and in the Bell Telephone Laboratories, also in the States. And they wanted to create something that would involve scientists and artists cooperating here in Britain. So initial discussions took place late in 1968 with Sutcliffe and Yasha Reichardt, the curator of cybernetic serendipity, and George Mallen, together with John Lansdowne, who was an architect by profession, who also had an interest in computer choreographed dance. And we're going to see some of his work in a minute. And the CAS was founded as a special interest group of the British Computer Society, the BCS. And this was due to Sutcliffe's connections with the BCS, as he was a member. And of course, the aim was to explore the possibilities of using computers in a creative context. And there was a desire to promote creative computing in all art forms, which is why it's called computer arts, plural, based on an understanding of cybernetics that allowed a previously unknown degree of collaborative meaning-making for art. Now, although CAS was based in London, it had an international reach. And in 1970, there were members in all of continental Europe, North and South America, Japan, and there was even one member in Australia. And obviously, CAS still continues to this day. And you can see here on the slide on the lower right-hand side, there's an example of one of the bulletins that CAS produced called Page, started by Alan Sutcliffe, and the first editor was Gustav Metzger, and I'll show you some of his work in a moment. And it was called Page as a pun on paging, which was a type of memory storage for computing, and also because Alan Sutcliffe said there's only money for one page. We haven't got enough money at this point to produce more than one page of material as a bulletin, as a journal. So Gustav Metzger said, well, we'll call it Page. So this is in fact page number 4. And then behind there in blue is a brochure which sets out the aims of the society. And just as a little by the way, you can go on our website today, thecomputerartsociety.com that Sean mentioned, and I'll give you the web address again. And you can see every single issue of Page right from the very first issue in 1969. And they're as PDFs, and they're a marvelous resource. Okay, so the very first exhibition was Event 1, and this was in March of '69 at the Royal College of Art. And here you're looking at a poster. And as you can see, it included all of the arts. So again, this very strong emphasis on all aspects of arts, not just visual art. And it was very much an interdisciplinary show, and it defined the future direction of the society. And this was a culture of sharing and cooperation. And this ethos was at the very heart of CAS in the early days: sharing and cooperation, sharing of knowledge, resources, cooperating not only between practitioner, artist, and machine, but cooperating with each other. And this ethos still holds true today. And we must remember that this was pre-World Wide Web. So, it was not easy to get information or to connect with like-minded people. It was not that easy to meet others. So something like the Computer Arts Society was very much a focal point that you could meet, exchange ideas, and get information. And Ernest Edmonds, again, a member of the society from pretty much the beginning, has recently spoken about the sense of community in CAS as being very, very important. So artists and programmers cooperated together to create artwork working with machines. And this was still a very new concept in the UK at this time. And I can't emphasize this enough. This was completely outside the mainstream of British art. To work collaboratively with scientists, or to have scientists and technicians producing artwork, was something that was completely outside of the mainstream art world. And also I need to tell you that this was the first time that a computer entered the Royal College of Art specifically for the exclusive use of artists. And in fact, members of the public could get their hands on this computer too. So unlike cybernetic serendipity, it offered a chance for people to actually handle computing equipment. It was smaller than cybernetic serendipity, but several people said that it was preferable because they could actually talk to the artists, who were often to be found standing in front of their artwork. And you could have more of a one-to-one relationship and learn a little bit more. And again, that was part of the idea of Event 1, that it was a workshop type environment where sharing of knowledge, showing things that were work in progress, things didn't have to be finished objects, they could be work in progress, they could be experimental. This was all part of it. So here you're looking at an installation view of the exhibition just from one angle. And you can see on the walls are pinned up on boards some plotter drawings, impact prints, and so on. Now, some of these works are ones that entered the V&A collection, saved by George Mallen. And then down on the lower right-hand side of the screen, you're looking at a stage, a photograph of the stage of Event 1 where performances took place. And there are several members of CAS who've been identified there, which you can read about in the book if you're interested. So I'm going to tell you a couple of the things that you would have seen on view at Event 1. And that was, of course, Alan Sutcliffe's poem Spasmo. And this was handed out as part of the program. So when you entered the exhibition, you were given a photocopied catalog, and inserted into that was a unique computer generated poem produced by Alan Sutcliffe as part of his Spasmo project. This was a spoken text project, and it was originally written for a concert of electronic music with Peter Zinoviev, part of a whole performance piece incorporating music, text, visuals, and audience interaction. Now, Sutcliffe produced music on the ICL mainframe computer, as well as performing live on a PDP-8 computer, against a backdrop of visuals on stage. And the audience interaction part of the piece consisted of these poems generated using his own Fortran algorithm, which he output to a line printer. As you can see here, each printout had a unique poem from a run of 256. So this really is a great example of one of the main characteristics of computer-generated art, and that, of course, is iteration, the idea that you can make many examples, many pieces in a series with small changes put in place. So all of the 256 poems were unique. And the audience would get this printout, and they would read out stanzas at various times when they were told to, directed by the artist from the stage. And you can see he's written at the top here, "When you see the road, please say this poem beginning quietly." So there would be presumably a slide, a visual on the screen of a road. And if you had this particular poem, you had to read it out. Something else that I discovered as part of this project Creative Simulations, this new book, was this work by Diane Lifton. Now, Diane Lifton is now called Di Clay, and she produced, in conjunction with George Mallen, these mime scripts, computer-generated mime scripts. She was a dancer. She's in her youth, Diane, and she worked with Mallen to produce a program that would produce movements as well as positions, as well as tempo. So you can see here, waist swivel, right quarter fast, left knee close full fast. So it gives her positions that she can dance to. And she performed these as part on the Event One stage in front of a light and sound system that was designed by her then husband, John Lifton. Again, these scripts were discovered as part of the research for my book, so very, very exciting. I'm just showing you a little piece of one here. Here's a compilation of some other things that you would have seen at Event One, including, of course, computer choreographed dance and ballet notations produced by John Lansdowne. And that is in the lower left of your screen here. You can see the artist in his studio. He's sitting in front of a teletype, and can you see just there to the side of him is actually a telephone. So he's connected to a mainframe computer via the landline through the telephone network. And here he is producing computer-generated notation for dancers from the Royal Ballet School. And they produced dances at the exhibition, and also they were photographed in the newspaper. So this picture actually comes from the Daily Mirror. Also on view at Event One were films, including Tony Pritchett's Flexipede, and that's directly above there on the top left of your screen. This was the first fully computer animated film made in Britain, 1967. Opposite that, on the top right, is a work by Gustav Metzger. This is a metal model, which was part of his proposal for his mammoth piece, 5 Screens with Computer, which was a massive environmental artwork that was interactive, never fully realized. And then underneath that, you've got a clipping from the Evening Standard newspaper, which shows 2 actors performing John Lansdowne's computer choreographed sword fight. And I particularly like this picture because if you can just see there, the glasses are flinging off the fellow's face. And so it's a very dynamic, super picture that came out of the Evening Standard. All right, well, the next big exhibition for CAS was Computer Graphics 70, otherwise known as CG70. And this took place at Brunel University on the outskirts of London. And this was one of the very first computer conferences in the UK, and it was extremely well attended. And CAS was invited to produce a small exhibition of works on paper that, as you can see here on the left-hand side of the screen, mostly works on paper, were hung on panels around the room, and as well as they contributed papers to the conference. Now, for the CAS, this was a very important show for several reasons. Firstly, it was the very first time that Manfred Mohr exhibited his computer algorithmic drawings. Now, Manfred Mohr is now regarded as a major pioneer of computer algorithms in drawing, as you may know, and this is the first time he had exhibited these plotter drawings in public. At this point, he was living and working in Paris, and the fact that he chose CAS to exhibit these was indicative of the very high esteem that the society was held. This drawing that you're looking at here is now in the V&A as part of the CAS collection donated by SSL. Manfred Mohr also exhibited at CG70 a small wire sculpture, which you can see on the lower part on the right-hand side of the screen there. This is a metal sculpture made by using random numbers, and it's been set in resin, made out of wire and set into resin. Again, this is something that was kind of rediscovered, if you like, during my researches. Well, also at Computer Graphics 70, there was a symposium of papers given by members, and among these was a very prescient paper and a demonstration by two CAS members, Stroud Cornuck and Ernest Edmonds from the University of Leicester. Now, in this, they addressed an issue that was becoming very important at this time, and that is the implications of the role of the artist in the computational age. And in fact, their big question was, would the artist in the future have any role at all? And as you can see here, their paper addressed the point, is the artist amplified or superseded by the computer? And then in addition to this paper, they also produced an artwork, which was a sort of demonstration of their manifesto, if you like. And this artwork was called Data Pack. And that you can see what was produced in the lower left of the screen here. And that is kind of produced as a multiple in that it was the recording of the conversation that the participants in the artwork had with each other, mediated through the computer. And you can see Stroud Cornuck on the left of that photograph and Ernest on the right. And they are having a conversation mediated through the computer. And there's another picture of Ernest in black and white at the bottom using a teletype. And you can also see some of their code up there as well. So Cornuck and Edmonds argued that artists could, in fact, have a greatly amplified role, one that was integrated with societal concerns by using the exact materials and methods, i.e. the digital, of the technological society in which they found themselves. And to do this, they could hand over some of the artistic creation to the members of the audience themselves. And this would keep art relevant, exciting, and would mean that the artist is not superseded by the computer, rather he and she are amplified. And of course, these are questions that we're still debating today, particularly with regards to AI and image-to-text generators, which is a lot of which is going on at the moment. So this idea of a conversation between participants through an artwork was very much to come out again in the next big CAS project, which of course was the eco game. So whilst CG70 was taking place, members of the CAS had been working on what became the eco game. And this was a proposal that came from the Business Equipment Trade Association. And these people were having a trade fair at Olympia in 1970 called Computer 70. So Computer 70 should not be confused with CG70 that we just heard about. Computer 70 was a trade show held at Olympia exhibition halls, and the organizers approached CAS and said, we want something that will show an unusual but important application of computing in a social context. And CAS members met for the very first time to consider what this might be in January of 1970. And there was a lot of discussion, and you can read some of this discussion in the book. I've reprinted a article that John Lansdowne wrote about where he talks about the discussions. But eventually, the idea of a participatory game emerged. And several suggestions were put forward, including this one by CAS member Roger Saunders. Again, this is something that has come to light out of the CAS archive as part of my researches. And you can see that it's a diagram where he is modeling the economy and showing how industry, government, and households are all interrelated and how finances flow between them. So at this, we've got at the top of the diagram, we've got households in a box. In the middle, we've got government, and at the bottom, we've got industry, and he's got foreign countries sort of outside of that. And he's kind of considering how the economy works and how money moves around an economic system and all the different inputs that it would have a bearing on. But however, in the end, it was decided to settle on a more simplified version of a game so that it could be better and more easily understood. And this is particularly because at this time we have to remember that people were not used to using computers, and they might not have had much experience of how to work and speak through a computer. So a much more simplified version was actually decided upon. And this became, of course, the eco game, the collaborative project. And this was led by George Mallen. And it involved about 25 members of the Computer Arts Society. It was a very early example of computing technology used in a large-scale simulated environment. And the theme was cooperation and competition. So I guess today we might call it a type of serious game. And it was situated in a dome, as you can see here, from John Lansdowne's drawing. Now, EcoGame was a computer-controlled simulation that modeled an economic system, and it became the very first digitally driven, multiplayer, interactive gaming system in the UK. Now, Mallen did a lot of the programming on it in his spare time, working at night from home. He was attached to a teletype, via a teletype, to a remote time-sharing computer. And it was so noisy, the clacking of this teletype, that he had to cover it in blankets and duvets so he didn't wake up his small children who were sleeping upstairs. Anyway, as you can see here from this nice drawing by John McNulty, EcoGame actually contained elements of both ecology and economics. And these were two issues that were of great concern to the creators, and particularly with reference to the oil industry and issues of pollution. So it's about both ecology and economics and how the both might impact human decision-making. So here's John McNulty drawing a participant going through the motions, making their choices on a screen. And you can see just above the screen there is actually a phone, a landline connected to a remote time-sharing computer. So it really makes a striking juxtaposition between the human-made computer hardware and the natural foliage. So here you can see a flow chart of the structure of the game. So all the players started off with a finite amount of resources that came from a central pot. And they were then asked questions and had to make decisions. And the societal cost of these decisions was calculated by the system. And then it allocated an amount to either personal wealth or societal wealth. So it could be good for society in general, or it could be good for yourself in a selfish sense as a player. So the players separately allocated their resources in a way which in some sense maximized their private satisfactions. And the computer aggregated these environmental impacts, the impacts that their decisions had, and translated them into visual terms. And this is what, and here I'll show you another flow chart. It's based on cybernetic principles of inputs and outputs and feedback. So you can see that the available resources, the wealth for distribution, as George Mallen has written here on the diagram, it moves down to the different players. He's got A, B, C, and D. Depending on the decisions that they make, the resource flow either dissipates or it gets put back into the system and gets recycled again. But of course, the important point, and this is where the art comes in, I think, the important point is that the players' decisions determined the visuals that were shown. And of course, this is really quite hard to comprehend in 1970. I mean, nowadays we're so used to just, fiddling with things on our phone, and we instantly get visuals and we're interactive all the time. But, these were 35 millimeter slides in slide projectors that were projected onto screens situated around the dome. So this is really quite an astonishing feat, quite frankly. And these photographs showed both the general level of affluence in the economic game under the control of the players, but it also showed the relevant prosperity or effectiveness of each individual player. So in fact, the picture that you were going to get on the screen depended on the consequences of your behavior, and it was illustrated in a very visual way. Now, these slides, there were 720 different slides. They were put into computer-controlled slide projectors, and the computer could access any particular slide within seconds. So you made your decision, and the slide would flash up almost immediately, which again was really very, very surprising for people and completely wonderful. Everyone loved it. So here's a couple of examples of some of the pictures that were used as slides. So if you, as a player, made a decision that was profitable for yourself, but bad for society overall, well, you might get the slide flashing up like this one at the top of the screen on the left there, which is a kind of hideous sort of 17th century medical procedure and a kind of nasty sort of example. Or if you made a different decision, a different choice, which perhaps was beneficial towards society and therefore put some of the resources back into society, you might therefore be able to fund modern medicine and science and well-trained doctors. And that's what you've got illustrated here with the example on the lower part of the screen on the right. So there were 720 of these different pictures, and they were all contributed by members of the Computer Arts Society who sent in images that they thought would be good for the game. Now, just to remind you that this system was entirely built from scratch. All the hardware had to be sourced and assembled and then hand-coded. And this live interaction over a network, because the terminals were linked to a remote time-sharing computer, this was using technology that had never been put together before in this way, a very impressive feat for 1970. So in the original iteration, which was at Computer 70, in 1970, under the dome, as we saw, there were 9 Tektronix graphics terminals, and these were the first such terminals in Europe that had tracker ball interaction. So very, very advanced. These were attached to a computer-controlled 35 millimeter slide projector, as we talked about. These were controlled by an interface from Electrosonic. And then there were acoustic couplers linked to the terminals to the remote time-sharing computer. There was also an IDEA microcomputer-driven interactive graphics system, which had a large screen and a light pen interaction, which was also linked to the remote mainframe. So it was about using interactive digital art as being a force for the positive change required in the face of ecological and climate emergency, based on the idea of simulation. And that really, I think, is the power of EcoGame. It lays in its output as a graphic qualitative interpretation rather than a purely numerical interpretation of what was happening to the economy that was created by the participants in the game. And of course, every game was different because every participant was different and produced a completely different scenario each time. So after being shown in London in 1970, it toured to the first European Management Symposium in Davos. And this is the forerunner of the World Economic Forum. In fact, it is the very first World Economic Forum. And it was at the personal invitation of Klaus Schwab, who came to Jascha Reichart asking for something that was similar to cybernetic serendipity. He wanted this for his first Davos. Well, Reichart pointed him in the direction of CAS, and a version of the EcoGame was developed by System Simulation because George Mallen had by this date established his company System Simulation, and they put the game on in Davos. And you can see here on the photograph on the lower left, there's some people participating in the game. It was a slightly different setup in that it wasn't in a dome at this stage. And also there's a fabulous collage drawing there, diagram on the top right of the screen by George, where he's laying out how many terminals he can get, how many people he can fit in the room, and he's put a collage, little pieces of a graph paper on there. Again, that's something that was discovered as part of this research for this book. So actually, just before I move on, I'll tell you a little bit more about Davos. It was played by 450 delegates from 31 countries. And this included chief executives and senior managers and companies, top companies in Europe. Also, there were faculty members from the top business schools in the United States. And it was a huge success. And this really shows how participatory interactive artworks like EcoGame can appeal to a very diverse range of people. Now, the EcoGame was seen by Stafford Beer, a British pioneer in cybernetics and someone who was much admired by George Mallen. And as a result, Beer utilized the slide projection technology as part of his infrastructure for his project CyberSyn, which he was developing around this time. Now, this was going to be a decision-making room for industrial planning and communications, and it was developed for Salvador Alon's government in Chile. Now, unfortunately, this was never completed. It was abandoned because there was a coup and the government was overthrown. However, you can see that this idea of participants interacting through computers, their decisions mediated through computing, came from the EcoGame. Now, after this, George Mallen himself moved to the Royal College of Art, where he went to take up a research fellowship in the Department of Design Research. And it was here that he focused on computer-aided design and animation. And he was instrumental in developing the department and introducing computing activities for specific use by artists. And here you can see the Computer Activities Unit, which was one of the initiatives that he developed. We've also got a fantastic photograph of George at this time on the left of your screen there that was found, located by Professor Stephen Boyd Davis, whom you'll hear from in just a moment. And again, this turned up as a result of research specifically done for this book. Stephen Boyd Davis has very kindly written a chapter about Mallen's time at the Royal College of Art. And it was here that several members of CAS, including Brian Refn-Smith, joined the department to teach, and also artists such as Colin Emmett and Alan Kitching came through the department and pursued work at the Royal College of Art, specifically in computing. And in fact, Colin Emmett joined in 1971 for a degree in computer animation by project, which is really quite astonishing, a very, very early example of where you could get a degree in computing and art. And his project, along with Alan Kitching, was the development of Antix animation software that they created so that they could make films. And they produced them on the Atlas computer, which is why you can see some examples here that include the Atlas facility, the Atlas laboratory. Now, the next big CAS exhibition was Interact in 1973. And this took place as part of the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. And this was a very big show, much bigger than Event One, and it had a much more diverse range of artists. They also received funding from the Arts Council. And this was great because it enabled CAS to fund the creation of some artworks, and I'll show you those in a moment. I've not got a huge amount of time left to talk about this, so I'm just going to say that you can read more about it in the book, but I will give you one or two things that you would have seen at Interact, including this, which I managed to discover had been shown up until now upside down. So this is an artwork you can see in the lower left of the screen. I beg your pardon, I moved forward. Lower left of the screen there, black and white. It's a work by Lambert Mertens, who was a member of the Dutch branch of CAS in Holland. And as I say, up until now, it's been displayed upside down. It's in the V&A. And even you can see over here on the left of the screen, there's a paper that Lambert Mertens wrote, I think in 1970. And even there, he put the piece upside down. However, I found this photograph of the installation of Interact which you can see there. And on the back, on a panel, you can see the artwork is the right way up. So we now know that this is the correct way up for the artwork. And here you can also see in the center a work by Edward Ignatovich that the man in the black jacket is interacting with. In fact, here again it is. This is Edward Ignatovich as the Bandit, which was one of the works that was funded by the CAS specifically for this exhibition. And this is George Mallen and his wife Sarah interacting with this work. This work estimated, it used feedback signals. It estimated the gender of the person interacting with it, and the teletype produced a statement as to your personality and your gender. And Alan Sutcliffe told me that it was remarkably accurate. Well, another funded CAS work was by Stephen Willits, and he conducted one of his major socially conscious participatory projects that uses local audiences. And here he was using a number of audiences in the Leith area of Edinburgh and some other areas. He called it the Edinburgh Social Model Construction Project. Willits, one of the major pioneers of conceptual art in Britain. Another work on View It Interact made specifically for the exhibition was by Ana Livia Cordero, who was the youngest participant. She was only 19 years of age, and she produced a computer choreographed television dance film specifically for the show called M3x3, which refers to a matrix, 3 meters by 3 meters. And here you can see a still from it. And Robin Shirley produced computer-generated poetry and performed this to music with his group, the Sunflowers. Now, Shirley was a crystallographer by profession, but he persuaded his university, which was the University of Surrey, to fund a computer poetry group. And this, I think, is probably the only computer poetry group that was funded at this time. This would have been in the advent of Event 1, so this would have been like 1969, 1970. So really astonishing. Anyway, here you can see he is performing his poetry, spoken text, and musicians are improvising to it. Now, around this time, the CAS produced a little book called Computers in the Creative Arts. And in my book, Creative Simulations, I used George Mallen's text from this book as a basis to talk about computer-generated poetry. So Mallen's text was called Wherever Next. And I use this as a basis to consider where computers and art generation might go in the future. And as part of that, I discovered these works by CAS member Peter Kilgannon, whom very little is known, unfortunately. However, he produced a computer-generated poetry language called Lyric. And here you can see a flowchart indicating how he categorized words and how it worked. So you can see that he put words into different types. He had articles, nouns, adjectives, verbs, etc. And he talks about how here the flowchart shows how the program chose those words. It had about a 300-word vocabulary. And he wrote poetry on an Algol, in Algol, the Algol computer language, on an Elliott computer. I cannot find where he was working on this Elliott. But an Elliott was a machine that was used quite a lot at the time in colleges and universities, so it's very probable that he was associated with that. This is a poem that he made in 1969. He, having got the generated text, he would then manipulate it and adjust it himself by hand. So here he has a poem called The Replacement, developed from his lyric program. And it's really a lovely poem. I won't read it now because we're running out of time. But these two poems, and there are other bits of poetry as well, were discovered in George Mallen's archive, personal archive, and have never been seen or reproduced since, before. So, again, very exciting, for me. Peter Kilgannon, it is known, produced work at Event 1 as well. But after about 1973, I totally lose track of him. So I don't know what happened to him, but I'm hoping that one day I can find out more. So if you are interested in exploring this subject in more detail, as I mentioned, the new book is called Creative Simulations. That's shown on the left-hand side of your screen there. It's published by Springer, and I would just say, do check that your university may very well have a subscription to Springer Books, at which point you can download a free ebook. And then if you're interested in a more general look at this field, The Computer in the Art Room, which is a book that dates from 2008, but I redid it as an ebook in 2021, that is also available now, as Sean mentioned, on Amazon and for Kindle and on iBooks and whatnot. Also have a look at my socials, where I do post a lot about this history. So I'm going to leave it there, and we can have some questions in just a moment, but I wanted to bring in Professor Stephen Boyd Davis from the Royal College of Art, who, as I say, worked very closely with me on the Creative Simulations book, and he wants to speak a little bit about some of his findings about George and his relationship with George Mallen. So I'm going to hand over to you, please, Stephen.
Catherine, thank you. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
I hope I can manage to speak. So thank you for a fascinating book and talk just now, and for the opportunity you gave me to do this research. I have known George Mallen for a long time, since the 1980s, but to be honest, that doesn't mean that I have known him well. And I really learned who and what George is by researching this chapter. And everything I learned made me appreciate his contribution all the more. So in the next 2 to 3 minutes, I'm just going to pick out two interrelated things that I want to highlight this evening, which kind of build on some of the messages coming out of Catherine's brilliant talk just now. The first of those is complexity. As you probably know, George Box famously said, and it was during the time that George was working at the RCA, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And of course, that's because all models and simulations simplify. But George's work is remarkable in his desire to retain as much complexity and subtlety as reasonably possible. And a key danger of any simulation is that you simulate the things that are easy to model and leave out the difficult bits. And that has never been George's way. So to give one example, it was relatively easy, even in the 1970s, to capture words and numbers and compute with them. But in his pioneering work at the RCA on how designers and architects in particular do their work, George always insisted on the multimedia, multimodal nature of the artifacts, the communications and the conversations that really constitute actual practice. And this is also reflected in his completely open attitude that Catherine remarked on to forms of knowledge: engineering, mathematics, art, design, economics, psychology, an attitude that may have come partly from his experience under Gordon Pask, but which certainly fell on fertile ground in George's mind. And George took a profoundly systems approach, which of course can mean a lot of things. In the case of architecture, this included not just what happens inside the architect's office, but how that interacts with what happens outside, with social structures and attitudes, regulation, building users, the world at large. My second and shorter feature is George's humanity, again, something that Catherine touched on. And in some ways, this is perhaps another way of saying what I've already just said. As I document in my chapter, there were others at the RCA at that time who thought that they had the answers to how computing could address architecture and planning. But what they wanted to do is almost certainly what Christopher Alexander was famously castigating when he said, people who are messing around with computers have obviously become interested in some kind of toy. They have very definitely lost the motivation for making better buildings. And what the other camp with the RCA were doing at the time, March and Steiny, essentially was making patterns, and woe betide humans if their complexity didn't fit the pattern. For Mallen, the realities of real people, societies, and users, what Pask wonderfully called the cussedness of organisms, was and is the challenge. A profoundly humane, sensitive, caring approach to the world. And in the case of architecture, probably one that if it had been followed wouldn't have allowed Grenfell Tower to happen. One last thing about George that inspires me and always has. George acknowledges that we can use computing to do faster things that we would have done anyway. When it gets exciting is when we do things that were not possible and perhaps could not have been imagined before. Thank you.
That's lovely. Thank you, Stephen. That's really great. I think, can we open it up for some questions or comments, Sean? Is it possible that people can be unmuted, or if they have anything, if someone would like to comment? I'm sorry, there was an awful lot of material in a very short space of time, so it's a lot to take in.